Hi, everyone. My name is Neetha Dick, and I'm the Dean of the College of Nursing at the University of Manitoba. I am delighted to welcome all of you to the March session of the 2022 Lunch and Learn series, presented by CASN's Research and Scholarship Committee. The three presentations in this Lunch and Learn series focus on Indigenous research. Many of us are familiar with the concept of a lunch and learn, where faculty members come together during the lunch hour to share with one another projects they are working on, and to dialogue and discuss methodologies, successes, and challenges they encountered in their work. This webinar series is intended to serve as an inspiration and networking opportunity for participants, while recreating the collegial feel of a lunch and learn. We will be recording today's session. We will begin with a presentation from our presenter, and we'll conclude with 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer after her presentation. To submit a question, please use the chat function. At this time, I am delighted to welcome and introduce our esteemed colleague at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Carrie Miller. Dr. Miller is the Associate Vice President, Indigenous, Scholarship, Research, and Curriculum at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Miller is a 60s scoop survivor who descends from the St. Croix and Leech Lake Anishinaabe communities in Wisconsin and Minnesota, respectively. For more than 25 years, Dr. Miller has transformed Indigenous scholarship, education, success, governance, research, and reconciliation at post-secondary institutions in the United States and Canada. She holds a doctoral degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can read a more detailed bio and the description of her presentation on the Lunch and Learn CASN webpage. In today's session, Dr. Miller will present on community engagement, building relationships and data sovereignty, research with Indigenous communities. We look forward to your session, Dr. Miller. I will now turn over the session to you.
Ojo, don't worry, the rest will be in English. I do like to start with that. One of the things that we'll note is the importance of positionality. A lot of my positionality was shared with you by Neetha, but it's also important for me to ground you in that myself. I wanted to sort of start from the point of view that as we reach out with research, similar to the way we're facing in medicine as a whole, that we're at a place where we need to reestablish trust. Mm-hmm. And, why does the distrust exist? The distrust exists because of bias in the healthcare system, because of a legacy of non-consensual medical testing, because of Indigenous removals to TB sanatoria, from which many children never returned home. One of the things that I do as a scholar is I'm helping to support residential school ground research, and we're finding many people from community coming to those discussions and asking about the sanatoria. So it's a very deeply held historical trauma for our communities. And also, of course, the legacy of residential schools. The university itself is a educational institution, and a lot of the historical trauma around residential schools continues to create a hesitancy and a distrust of educational institutions. So recognizing that many of these experiences are a result of colonialism, and others are results, perhaps, or people who have attributed to racism, I wanted to talk for a moment about the degree to which colonialism and racism intersect. Racism can exist independently of colonialism, but colonialism is always supported in part through racist ideologies and policies that assume the settler population has a natural, inevitable, moral, social, cultural, intellectual, and economic superiority. This leads to assumptions that the colonized group as a whole have some kind of a deficit, and that becomes used to justify the inequities between the colonized and the colonizer. So Indigenous people in Canada today continue to be racially constructed in very specific ways to maintain their inequitable positionality, with the result that they are victims of ongoing physical, intellectual, emotional, and cultural violence. And I think one of the questions that often comes to me is, but Carrie, you know, we've changed. This colonialism is in the past. And so I always like to remind us that even today, some of us, even the rooms that we're in, we are still benefiting from Canadian colonialism. I live in the city of Winnipeg. Our city gets its water from Shoal Lake First Nation, who is not allowed to use that water source by law. So do you know where your city and your institution gets its water? We look at hydro plants. Manitoba and Quebec in particular, hydro plants have flooded large amounts of productive Indigenous reserve lands, damaging traditional subsistence and tourism income as well as jobs. We have at least 36 Canadian First Nations that still do not have long-term access to safe drinking water and are under long-term boil water advisories. When you see that a number of these communities we have not yet been able to bring safe drinking water facilities to, they are often fly-in communities, which usually means everything that is coming to that community is flown in, or at best comes in on an ice road that is only open for a portion of the year. And just as an example, some of our scholars that work in food security and food sovereignty have been to northern communities and noted, first of all, they only have one store where all goods are sold, so there's a monopoly. And secondarily, a 24-pack of bottled water can cost as much as $100. So there are huge disparities. There are huge impacts of colonialism that are ongoing. So recognizing that colonialism is ongoing, this means that for Indigenous people, colonialism is in many ways an inescapable background noise that frames our social interactions with non-Indigenous people and certain institutional structures. So how do we get through that distrust? How do we establish the relationship? And I think particularly coming from helping professions, there's been kind of a assumption that going in to help, going in to fix is something that would be appreciated. But we have to remember that our current Canadian universities are products of the traditions, cultures, and languages of European immigrants, with the result that the institutions, policies, and practices of these immigrants to Canada have been based on the assumption that their way is universal, true, comprehensive, and right. And so the result of that has been a lot of pressures for assimilation, pressures that push Indigenous communities away from their ways of thinking, their ways of knowing, and their sets of ethics. So as I sort of introduced at the beginning, it's really important to consider what is your positionality, relationship, and interest in the project and the community that you're hoping to work with. So how do you clarify your awareness of and relationship to racism present in research materials that may be mandated by your institution's ethics process? Now, that may sound like a little bit of a shocking statement, but as somebody who has been head of an Indigenous studies program with master's and doctoral programs, the biggest hurdle right now for our students in those programs is the colonial construction of ethics processes. They feel insulted by them. They are often triggered by them. They fear that some of the instruments they are expected to use will actually be perceived as insulting by the people that they'd like to interact with. So really thinking about how that's coming across and how it can be mitigated is very important. Second, are you doing the research because that's what's in the granting agency's mandate this year, or because you're committed to doing this work? Honestly, if it's not the latter, I would consider looking for a different grant, because the kinds of relationships Indigenous communities are looking to build with researchers take a long time to establish, and are ones that, as we'll see, are expected to be ongoing. There's a strong resistance to and distrust of researchers who do helicopter research, which is kind of a slang for, I'm just going to pop in, do this research and leave, and probably not even share my findings with the community. That is certainly something that is not viewed kindly under OCAP principles. If you haven't familiarized yourself with OCAP principles, I've put a link for that in here. And you'll notice as you read them that, sometimes OCAP does not always completely align with an institution's ethics protocols. So I mentioned this idea of going into fix it. Good intentions without engagement can go astray. So this is a story from an individual at our institution that does a lot of community engagement. This particular interaction was in Central America. They spent $1,500 to construct a giant stainless steel raised bed to protect seedlings from flooding and climate change related threats, patting themselves on the back, feeling like they had done a really good thing. But in subsequent years going back, they found it wasn't being used at all because the community there grows their plants in chakras, which are sustainable micro ecosystems of companion plants, carefully designed as self-contained vegetal communities where each plant helps the others to grow and give the nutrients back to the soil. So, their technology works. So this $1,500 frame that they had brought down there was a waste. And in retrospect, they wished that they had spent time talking to the community, learned what the community needed, or even given that funding directly to the community. So, these are the kinds of pieces where, as we go in, assuming that Western methodologies, proven by science as effective as they are the best practice, without learning what the local community's practice is and whether it has better results, can be very problematic, or at least a waste of resources. So overcoming the barrier of distrust takes time. It requires building long-term relationships. It requires working with community members as partners, and may require allowing the community to have shared or complete ownership over data generated from the study. And that's where we're getting into the data sovereignty piece. So members of our campus community have put together a wonderful resource called Working in Good Ways. It is for community engagement, whether that's research engagement, whether that's learning engagement. This is about how to build that relationship with the community. And it talks first about 7 principles really that need to be in place as you develop the community engagement. So literacy. Have you learned about the histories, cultures, and experiences of the community with whom you would like to work in a manner that supports their sovereignty? Reflection. Have you developed critical self-awareness about what motivates you to work with Indigenous communities, your capacity for working with Indigenous communities, given the time expectation, and what relationship you will need to build with them? Relationship. Are you willing to build personal, whole relationships that precede, sustain, and will outlive the research project? Have you committed to engage in what we call relational accountability? Reciprocity. Are you willing to ensure that your research project results in mutual benefit, ownership, co-ownership, and accountability beyond basic remuneration and community protocols? Reciprocity creates a circle of commitment to one another and is not transactional. Protocol. Have you learned the nation and community specific practices to demonstrate respect for Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing? And are you willing to grow beyond institutional practices and procedures? A common protocol that many of us may be aware of is offering tobacco when asking for knowledge or sharing work with a First Nation community. But the Inuit communities, for example, don't use tobacco at all. And so if you were to approach an Inuit community, offer tobacco, this is not a protocol they use, and it's not establishing the relationship you seek to establish. So try to learn the nation and community specific practices. It is absolutely not rude at all when you begin initiating an encounter to say, what is it, what protocols do we need to follow? What are your expectations? We want to do so in a respectful manner. Humility. Are you ready to recognize that communities are also experts in the research partnership that you are developing? And collaboration. Are you ready to work in ways that work for the Indigenous community, and even in ways that may create partnerships where the community has comparatively greater power in deciding what work needs to be done, why it needs to be done, how it should be done, and how it should be shared? So we have a 5-step framework for ethical engagement that came out of the work of these folks at our campus. And we talk about these stages as the work before the work, forming the partnership, maintaining the partnership, closing the partnership, and the relationship after the work. In other words, the expectation that the relationship continues. So, and as tied to this is the importance of relational accountability. Relationality and relational accountability are core values that form the foundation of many Indigenous worldviews. It's encoded in the ways that we introduce ourselves in our own languages. When I introduced myself to you in my language, I gave you my name, but I also gave you my clan and my nation. So I am already describing the relationality that I have as an individual with these other units of society in a way that is not really done in the Western world. So relationality is very foundational. It's expressed through kinship. It informs how we understand, relate to, interact, and recognize obligations with each other, with the natural world, and everything in creation. So this relational Indigenous paradigm recognizes that all things in the natural world are related, that we are responsible to and for our relationships, and that plays into the expectations communities have when engaging with researchers. This also means that you may be held accountable for past mistakes that are not of your making when you approach a community. And so in this example, when Annie Chen started working in Northern Manitoba, she and her students met with a lot of distrust because of the community's previous experience with universities and institutions. They directly questioned the point of the partnership, whether the community would derive any benefit. And rather than denying the community concerns or becoming defensive, it's enormously important to listen to people's concerns and put the time and effort into repeat visits that will relationship build and will develop long-term community-led collaborations to demonstrate that what has happened in the past, we are going to do things now in a different way. So if you were to go to the website where we have, I think, an 86-page report, this is the lovely infographic that takes you through the various different stages that I'm about to address. So the first one is the work before the work. And this is enormously important. This is the stage at which you are getting over that trust barrier. This stage needs to happen before you fully set up all of the parameters of the study, before you apply for ethics, because the trust that you are going to respect the community as an equal partner needs to be there from the outset. So this is a moment where you should be seeking out Indigenous teachers, spaces, and resources, creating space and time to engage in self-reflection about the work and about your interactions as you have them, and to simply be present in community and spend time with people. I can't emphasize enough how important it is when to overcome that distrust, to simply attend events, to simply show up, to when they say, well, we'd like to have a feast to open up this partnership, go to the feast and bring the entire team, right? You have to build those relationships in that way. Choosing not to do them will have the community feel that you are engaging with them in a dismissive, condescending, and disrespectful way. So I think I've already covered these 2 points, so I want to make sure we get to all my points here. Relationship building takes time, and the trust necessary for good data generation is predicated on the relationship building. You want to ensure that the challenges that are true of collaborative research generally are really attended to, because they are usually heightened in an Indigenous context. So even if you have done community engaged work before, really be attentive as you move through these steps with an Indigenous community. The other sort of more general, and I am going to throw out from time to time some of the structural institutional pieces that intersect with this work. Tenure and promotional guidelines need to be adjusted to recognize the time commitment of community engaged work as an important relationship building function, not only of the individual's research, but in a way that recognizes how building these relationships supports the mission of the entire university. And I'll talk about that more as I go. If at first you do not succeed in your funding attempt, try again. And this gets back to what I mentioned earlier about helicopter researchers. If you come to the community and you have asked the community to invest their time and energy into research project design, if you don't get funding on that first round and say, oh, well, too bad, have a nice day, I'm going off into the sunset. Again, the community will feel used. They will feel that they have invested time and energy with no outcome. The communities themselves have significant experience getting grants for projects that are meaningful to them. And in many cases, they probably have been through denial of a grant and moved on either to adjusting and applying again in another round, or to a different funding source. So communities are aware of how grants work, and they are really going to want to see you have a commitment to, if we didn't get funding this time, we will try again, because we recognize the importance of the project you have co-developed with us to your needs as a community. Relationships really need to be genuine. And, I mentioned already, show up and go to community events, but above and beyond that, be humble and helpful. If you take the time at a community event to pop into the kitchen and help with preparing food or washing dishes, if you help with setup or takedown of chairs or whatever needs to be done, if there is a sacred fire and you say, hey, can I help chopping wood? I threw my axe in the trunk just in case, right? All of these kinds of things are ways to demonstrate that you have a genuine interest in the well-being of the community outside of your research objectives that in many ways the community will view as helping you. So when you choose to be generous and to show up and to be helpful, you will be amazed and surprised and at how quickly you start being able to get to a place of trust. The quality time is really important. I had a researcher ask me, he said, I've been invited to a pipe ceremony. Is it okay if I bring my kids? And I said to the researcher, I said, that is such a thing you should do, because bringing your kids demonstrates a trust and a willingness to connect, a willingness to be there as a whole person that will be very, very welcome and received. So this work of showing up, building relationships and learning from the community often happens on your own time. You're going to powwows on the weekend. You're attending some evening events. While we should advocate for more university recognition and support, there will always be a personal responsibility in this work that we need to acknowledge and be willing to meet. So getting to know people on an individual level is fundamental to our ways of being as Indigenous people and are fundamental to this building of trust. So I already mentioned that there may be some aspects of institutional change. What institutional systems do Indigenous communities have to navigate in order to partner with us? And do any of them constitute barriers? If the community experiences some of these systems as barriers, what can we do to support them? And who can help us make the needed changes within the university? Who are the people or offices within our institutions that are responsible for listening to community feedback and advocating for change? If one doesn't exist, create it. That's literally what I'm in the process of doing at University of Manitoba. And how can we modify our work processes to better document and communicate institutional barriers encountered by our Indigenous community partners? So forming the partnership, you've taken the time to build that relationship. Now you're beginning to talk about the project itself, and you really want to make sure that you are working on a design that will all, not only meet your interests as a researcher, but is also designed in such a way that it provides community benefit. So this is also an area in which you're going to need to look at your ethics protocols and be aware that some First Nations have their own ethics protocols that must be followed in addition to university processes. So ensure your ethics procedures, observe them, ensure that your ethics procedures require community consultation before rather than after ethics approval. This is one of the run-ins my students have had is ethics telling them, you can't talk to the community and develop the project with them because that is somehow a breaking of a barrier of removal of the researcher from the community. Indigenous communities want you to be invested, want you to be engaged, and that kind of removal doesn't work in that context. So also, as you consider your project, participants may want credit for the knowledge they provide rather than anonymity. That should be reflected in your consent form. Recognize and privilege orality and other community cultural protocols. Respondents may respond with a story rather than a direct answer to a question. Methods that recognize the importance of kinship and relationality in the community are also enormously important. Conversational approaches to interviews rather than a set list of questions, which feels very institutional and alienating. So I mentioned sometimes residents will respond with a story rather than a direct answer. I have a colleague who is doing research on salmon populations in the north and how they would be impacted by a particular hydro project and was interviewing community members with regard to that. And he kept talking with this elder who's still was very actively using his trap line right near where these salmon had their spawning grounds. And so he said, okay, how is this potential impact of the salmon going to affect your trap line? And he would say, well, let me tell you about the raccoons. No, I'm not interested in the raccoons. I'm here to talk about the fish. And this went on for a year before he realized that what the elder was trying to explain through this story was the larger web of relationships that he understood all of these animals on his trap line to be in. So when he goes during the spawning season and catches his share of salmon, he cleans the fish right there on the riverbank and leaves the offal. And then here come all of these fur-bearing animals that come down and eat that offal, and it helps to strengthen them as squirrels, as otters, as other creatures that he is nurturing and really managing as a farming population. He is paying attention to how many babies are born to each of those animal families every year. He's out on that trap line daily, not just when he's setting and checking traps. So letting people tell you the information that they feel is important for you to know is enormously important, because you may not comprehend what you need to know in regards to your research. Partner remuneration: respect the contributions of colleagues and partners and ensure that they're properly remunerated. A good practice is to reflect on whether colleagues are getting paid to engage in a reflective discussion when community counterparts are expected to do so for free. So, that's a very important thing to consider. Our university is setting up specific guidelines on that for researchers. You also should consider whether a memorandum of understanding or memorandum of agreement is necessary on the parameters of the relationship between the parties, or as an agreement is a more specifically legal binding document that describes the responsibilities of the partners for a specific project or objective. So I mentioned that, we have nations that have their own protocols. Oftentimes First Nations government, Métis Local, and the Nunavut Research Institute will have that engagement as part of their MOU. And I have the link here to the Nunavut Research Institute. They actually ask researchers to become licensed to engage in research in their territories. The MOU should not be used as a document to restrict the decision-making powers of community partners, but rather than to empower them. And your university legal office will likely want to vet your MOU and your MOA. You should look at balancing responsibilities to the Indigenous partner, the protocols and needs of each Indigenous community, and the community outputs that may not directly benefit the researcher, but justify the community investment of time. Do they want workshops to train their people? Do they want work plans? Do they want a copy of the report that's written in plain language rather than academic language? So data is an important thing to consider in these kinds of agreements. Data access and control has historically been managed by institutions or individual researchers who claim ownership over the data and analysis on which academics build their careers through publishing. So, increasingly we're seeing communities raise data sovereignty. The number of webinars and instructional opportunities around data sovereignty over the past 2 years has been large, and I really encourage, if you see those opportunities, to take them. Communities may want to know that the data at your university is going to be restricted only to this project, that it will be created in such a way that the community can have a password to review that data independently. And there may be a desire for the community to maintain access and to ownership of that data afterwards. In particular, there are examples in Canada of researchers recording Indigenous stories, and then later when they come by and say, my grandmother passed away, could I have a copy of her stories? The researcher says, no, these are my property and I'm still creating publications from them, so you can't have them. You can see what an enormous loss that is to the community, how disrespectful and insulting that is to the community. So increasingly upfront, communities want to have a conversation about that data and how they can retain control and access to their own Indigenous knowledge. This may result in a need to reassess your institutional IT structure. It may mean that data storage and hardware capacity, security software have to be restructured to accommodate partitioning and restricted access for community-owned data. If peer review of data is needed during the analysis phase, the community should be consulted for approval. And the community right to data should include access to the findings in common language in a report or presentation accessible to the community as a whole. So maintaining the partnership, and I'm running short on time. I want to give you time for questions. So I'm going to go a little faster, skip a few more slides. I am going to make the slide deck available at the end of this program. So maintaining the partnership is as new decision points come up over the progress of the research, make those decisions with the community. I talk about, in terms of know how we can contribute, but let the community determine our role. I talk about making a menu of options. So when we were approached by a community with regard to residential school grounds research, I looked across the university and said, okay, we've got to talk to anthropology. We've got to talk to geology, where they have the GPR technicians and knowledge. We need to talk to historians and people who do oral history in our community. And I laid out all of the different ways, all of the different teams that can contribute. So we can expand your knowledge about the archival materials that are available through the NCTR and federal documents. We can do various types of ground search research. Here are the limitations of different types of ground research. And if you want to go on to the point of sending children home to their families if their remains are found, then we're talking about archaeology, DNA testing. These are the options. You tell us what teams you would like us to mobilize, and how you would like us to pursue this work. So, informing the community of their options is certainly very welcomed, but let the community determine the role. In this case, we were presenting that to a tribal council, and they came back and let us know the steps that they were willing to commit to at that time. And we will continue, as we get data points, to come back to them and make decisions with them on an ongoing basis through the project. So one of the things I'm going to point out here is the need for an Office of Indigenous Research. I'm in the process of establishing one at U of M. They also have them at UBC and University of Calgary. This is another institutional consideration. That office can provide training to ensure that researchers understand the practices of community engagement, that they are providing guidance on MOU and MOA development, that they are working with the Ethics Protocols Office to maintain practices that the community wants included, to provide relationship continuity with the community should the research partners in the project leave the university, so that that relationship to the institution can continue with additional research. Provide an office through which communities can register concern about a project, provide introductions between communities seeking collaborations and researchers interested in doing that, provide advice to the institutions on policies and procedural changes. So closing the partnership, be humble about who did the work and why it could be done. This may include identifying community partners as secondary authors on the work. But talk with them, find out what level of recognition they would like to have, whether it's citing their contributions, whether it's being a secondary author or being anonymous. All of those could be things that the community desires. Say goodbye properly. The community will probably want to open the project with ceremony and close the project with ceremony. Show up and participate in both and find out what your gifting obligations are at those events. And demonstrate gratitude and make sure that if there have been any conflicts, that they've been addressed. And then finally, the relationship after the work. So relationships as we build them with Indigenous communities should be reciprocal, and they should involve a lot of reflection to make sure that we're working in a good way. Have we followed through with our commitments? Have we assumed institutional accountability for how this research was conducted? But also, if your research experience with the community has earned their trust, they are likely to propose other opportunities for research collaboration and training. We've already had requests from the community we're working with for training some of their members in the research methods that we are using. This has resulted in application to some of our graduate programs from undergraduates from that nation that are at our institution. So we've moved from, well, I shouldn't say moved from, because we're still engaged in the research stage, but the trust has been built up to already build in other projects and opportunities for the university and the community to work together. So I have 2 pages of some suggested resources. I'll leave that for when I send it out to you to take a look at. But they cover both working together and then also Indigenous methodologies themselves. So thank you for taking the time to come today. I hope that this has been very helpful as you all think about ways to positively engage with Indigenous communities, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for your excellent presentation. And we'll open the floor now for discussion and welcome any questions or comments that you have for Dr. Miller. Please use the chat function to let us know about your question. And Dawn Fleming and myself will be monitoring the chat function for any questions that you may have. So open up the floor to whoever would like to get started with your question.
I love it when my talks are so clear and crystal that everybody just...
Well, while we await that first question, I was really interested to hear about the Office of Indigenous Research, Dr. Miller, that will be established. What a great support that would be for researchers and anyone engaged in that research process. We do have a question now. I have a raised hand here from Pauline. So go ahead, Pauline.
Thank you. Hi, it might be a bit of a stupid question, but when you were talking about the person bringing their families to the ceremony, is it not appropriate as well to ask permission from the elder to be able to bring others with you, or is that considered an insult, or is it just assumed that it's appropriate to bring other members without asking?
Well, in this case, this was a pipe ceremony to open the project that the tribal council had asked their elders to do. And so because of that context, the elders are in conversation with the elders about who is appropriate to bring and who can and can't come. I certainly encouraged him to go ahead and do it. I said, certainly you should run it past, our partner on the tribal council. So I think you're right that if this is more independent, if this is outside of that kind of a relationship with the tribal council, which some research is more direct with community, in that case, you should talk with either the elder leading the ceremony, or at the very least, the individual that invited you to the ceremony, because they'll have a sense of the protocols and what's appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So we have another question, Carrie, from Vanessa. Is there any resources for data generation strategies for the Indigenous community? Any specific websites to evaluate an Indigenous framework?
Wow, yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm going to preface it with the fact that the NCTR is on our campus, and one of the things that they've been working on is how to create opportunities for data sovereignty pertaining to their collections with communities. I had a meeting with our IT director at the university the other day. I was talking to him about data sovereignty issues, and he actually said that it's a struggle because the perfect program for what communities want still has not been developed within our IT circles. And this is surveying, what's out there, not assuming that the university has to come up with it itself. So I think we are in some ways in the process for developing resources for data generation, but I would definitely say, find out what the desires of the community are around data protection, and then make sure that you have a conversation with your IT personnel at the university about how you can maintain that. As far as evaluating Indigenous frameworks, one of the pieces that I have at the end of the slideshow is a whole list of scholarly works around research with Indigenous communities that are going to go into some of that detail. And then we have another question from Diana that TNP guidelines should be modified in terms of timelines for this important work. What important and specific thoughts have you regarding these positive changes? When we look at our tenure and promotion guidelines now, there's a certain degree to which we're looking for volume of publication, as well as number of times that works are cited. So this disincentivizes certain things. If, for example, you've been asked to do expert witness testimony and compile a report for a court proceeding, you may not be able to publish that until the court proceeding has concluded, which, if it's appealed, may be a very long time. A lot of our younger Indigenous scholars are interested in using publishing houses that are more accessible to community as well as scholarly audiences. Are those publications and scholarly houses considered as prestigious or recognized in the same way in the tenure and promotion process? And finally, simply the timeline, right? I'm actually on a search right now for an executive research position at our university where there is some discussion, because we have applicants who are doing community-based research and applicants who are not. And there is disagreement within the committee itself around whether we can recognize the community-based researchers as active researchers because their publications are slower and more spaced out. Those of us who do community work have argued absolutely they are as active in research as the rest of us. So raising that awareness across our institutions and also getting that recognized in tenure and promotion is really important. We have a real need to retain those young Indigenous scholars that we're bringing to our campuses, and a need to make sure that they can get past the associate level to that full professor point. And those are bottlenecks that can be impacted by not giving full recognition to community engaged work and the wide amount of value that work brings to the rest of the university. The trust built by one research project leads to relationships with other entities at the university and further opportunities for research that might not otherwise have been opened up.
Thank
Any
you
other-
very much for sharing
Sure.
that information. We have a few thank yous in our chat for an excellent presentation and for your response to the questions. So I'll just invite if there's any further questions or comments for Dr. Miller. You've touched on so many excellent topics and very relevant to our current experience in trying to engage in this very important work. So would welcome, there's another thank you for a great presentation, Carrie.
I was happy to be here, and as I said, I'll make the slides available so that you can follow up on some of the embedded links and recommended texts.
Yeah, those resources are very much appreciated. I think we're all looking for resources these days, and so I really appreciate you creating that list of resources that will be available to everyone. So certainly getting lots of feedback in terms of having a very helpful presentation and covering relevant topics and being insightful and informative. So great to see that great feedback, Carrie.
Well, as I say, it was a pleasure to be here.
We very much appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today and to share this important, your expertise and the important work that you're doing in your work and sharing that with us and helping us in terms of really moving forward with Indigenous research. So thank you for everyone who's attended today. Really appreciate the great turnout and your input and feedback. And with that, I'll just thank you again, Dr. Miller. We have recorded this session, and we will note that the session will be made available on CASN's YouTube channel and circulated to you in the coming days. So please feel free to share the link within your networks. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And CASN certainly hopes that you will consider attending the final session of this Lunch and Learn series on Indigenous research, which will take place on Tuesday, May 10th, and look forward to a presentation from Erica Hurley from the Memorial University. So again, thanks again to everyone for your participation and have a great day.